This last weekend, I built a new box because the one I'd previously built got kind of worn out in the winter weather. And I managed to gather together some off-cut material at my job to build it. So I was able to build this box basically for free, which is really nice because lumber costs right now are kind of through the roof. So it makes any woodworking project kind of expensive. So the box that I built is a pretty typical box that you would build, nothing that special, but I just wanted to kind of show the process. The dimensions of the finished box are 10 inches tall, 18 inches wide, and just 5 feet long. It's a little shorter in length than I'd normally like to make, but I wanted something that would fit in my car a little bit easier without having to completely fold down both the back seat and the front seat. So making a box that's only 5 feet long, I'm able to put it in my car by only folding down just the back seat. I have some pieces of 1/2 inch plywood and 1/4 inch plywood that I'm using to build this box. So the 1/2 inch plywood is for all the sides, and then the 1/4 inch plywood I'll do 2 layers for the top surface of the box, so ultimately the top will also have a 1/2 inch of plywood. One thing I like to do lately when making skateboard obstacles that use angle iron is to cut a shallow recess on the edge where the angle iron is going to go, so it sits more flush with the surface of the obstacle. I just think it looks a lot nicer and works a lot nicer. So I'm using the table saw to cut that shallow recess on some of my pieces. And let me just go ahead and say that this is probably not the correct way to do this or the correct tool to use to do this. It is honestly pretty risky because I'm using really large pieces of plywood in a vertical orientation and really risked some dangerous kickback. Fortunately, I was able to do it without any error in the cut or injury to myself, but just because I did it doesn't mean that you should. A router on a router table with a fence probably would have been a more appropriate choice to make the recess that I wanted to make. Regardless, once I had all that done, all I had to do was just cut some 2x3s down to length, and then I had all my pieces ready to assemble my box. The last thing I wanted to do before I began assembly was to just cut some holes in the 2 ends so that there would be a nice handle to grab onto when lifting the box and transporting it around. So I did that just by cutting a couple holes using a spade bit on a drill, and after I cut 2 holes, then I was able to just use a jigsaw to cut the rest of the opening. This is such a small and lightweight obstacle that these hand holes are not really that necessary, but I still think they're a nice touch. After I cut them out, I just did a little bit of sanding to get rid of any splinters, because you definitely don't want those getting into your hands. Once I had all my pieces, I began assembly, and whenever I'm assembling a skateboard obstacle, I definitely want to use a drill to drill pilot holes so that when I put in the screws, I don't risk splitting any of the wood, because that can be really frustrating and you usually have to cut a new piece to replace the split one. I also like to use wood glue wherever I can when I'm building a skateboard obstacle. It's totally optional, you don't have to do it, but I think it increases the overall strength and stiffness. And since I'm already using pretty lightweight material, anywhere I can make up a little extra strength is definitely useful. I first assembled the ends of the box with some of the 2x3s, and then that made it really easy for me to just attach the sides to get the general structure set in place. Sometimes you find yourself needing to use clamps just to hold things together temporarily while you screw parts together, since if you're working by yourself, you don't have an extra set of hands to do it for you. I also wanted to make a little note about why I'm using 2x3s instead of 2x4s. One reason is just that I was able to get them for free as recycled material. But the other reason is I actually like using 2x3s sometimes anyways, just because they're always a little bit cheaper than a 2x4, which makes sense since it's less wood. But they're always a little bit lighter too, which definitely helps when you need to transport the obstacle by yourself and don't have a friend to help you. And I find that even though it's technically not as strong as using actual 2x4s, in a lot of applications, a 2x3 is good enough for my purposes. Once I had the basic frame together, I just needed to add in a number of extra supports across the length of the box. So I just spaced them out equidistant between each end of the box, marked them out with a tape measure, and then screwed them into place. One lucky thing was the plywood on the sides of the box was bowing in slightly, so it kind of neatly held these pieces of 2x3 in place while I screwed them in. Otherwise, I would have had to use that clamp trick to hold them for me, so that made things a little bit easier. The style that I've constructed this box in is really typical of a lot of boxes that people make. I feel like a lot of obstacles that I've been making lately have some kind of quirk or something unique to them, so it's actually really nice to just keep it simple and do something really basic, and sometimes the simplest thing works the best. After I had the whole frame assembled, I just needed to put the top sheets on. I put the first sheet of 1/4" plywood on and just tacked it in place with just a couple screws to hold it where it belonged. Then I rolled out a whole bunch of wood glue to bond it to the second layer. Again, this is just to add a little extra stiffness and strength that I wouldn't otherwise get by only screwing it together. I attached the second layer of 1/4" plywood, and I also very crudely countersunk my pilot holes by just aggressively running a Phillips head bit in the pilot hole for a little bit. Not the most appropriate use of that tool, but it did the job. I did a little finish sanding just to make sure things were kind of nice, and then I put on a coat of white paint just to seal everything, and hopefully that will increase the durability and lifespan of this obstacle. While the paint was drying, I needed to do a little bit of work to prepare the angle iron that was going to go on this box. This angle iron actually comes from a previous obstacle, and I had painted this angle iron with some spray paint, so I wanted to scrape that off with a scraper. And since this box is only 5 feet long, I actually needed to cut the angle iron down to a shorter length. So I just clamped it in place and did a little bit of hacksawing, and once I cut the excess off, I just filed it a little bit so there weren't any sharp ends. Once that white paint was dry, I actually wanted to add some color to the box, so I just painted it light blue with a can of Rust-Oleum spray paint. As a final step, I just needed to attach the angle iron, but since I had cut off an entire foot, I needed to add one new countersunk hole for a screw that would help attach the angle iron to the box. So I did that by first drilling a pilot hole and then using a larger bit to drill the countersink. I also had to bore out that center hole a little bit more to accommodate the shaft of the screw. When I first did the countersink, it was pretty close to being flush, but I just needed to bore it down a little deeper so that the head of the screw would be below the surface of the angle iron. Once I did that, all I had to do was just screw it to the box. It's always really exciting when you get to the very end of a project and it's right near completion. The excitement is always really high. I hope you enjoyed seeing me build this box, And I know I didn't really go into a lot of details about the specifications, but I think it should give you an idea of how a box can be built. And certainly I have some access to some nice tools like a table saw, but you don't need to use fancy tools to build an obstacle like this. Most skateboard obstacles can be built with just a drill and a circular saw, maybe a jigsaw to cut transitions if you're making a quarter pipe. If you want to build an obstacle of your own, scrounge together some materials, ask around and see what you can get for free. And if you don't have tools, see if your neighbors have some you can borrow, or maybe a family member or a friend. You can definitely make it happen. The music in this video comes courtesy of Isaac Challis Eaton's new album, Goes to the Store. I actually did the album art for this record, so I hope you go check it out. Thanks for watching!